The Quiet Train. Chapter 1. The Delay. The train stood still at the platform in the small station of St. Flour. It was supposed to leave at 7:15, but the clock now showed 7:42. No announcement had been made. No one explained the reason. The passengers sat quietly inside the carriage, waiting without questions. The air was cold, and the windows were fogged from the morning chill. Outside, the sky was pale, and the hills of Auvergne were covered in soft mist. Julien Morel sat near the window, his hands resting on his knees. He wore a simple coat and a wool scarf. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired. He had worked on trains for most of his life, but now he was retired. He was traveling to see his daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. The delay didn't bother him. He had learned long ago that time often moved differently for those who waited. He looked out at the tracks and remembered the sound of engines, the rhythm of wheels, and the quiet moments between stations. Clara Winter sat 2 rows behind him. She held a small book in her lap but didn't read it. Her fingers touched the edges of the pages, but her eyes were fixed on the glass. She was an English teacher, quiet and thoughtful. She had taken this train many times before, but today felt different. She was thinking about a letter she had written weeks ago but never sent. It was still in her bag, folded and hidden. The delay gave her time to think, but also time to doubt. Louis Becker sat near the middle of the carriage. He was young, with messy hair and a notebook full of sketches. He wanted to study art in Paris, but he wasn't sure he was good enough. He looked at the other passengers and wondered about their lives. He imagined stories for each of them, drawing lines between faces and thoughts. The train delay felt like a pause in the world, a moment where everything stopped and waited with him. Marie Duval sat near the door. She was old, with silver hair and a soft coat. Her hands held a small photo of a man in uniform. She had been a nurse for many years, and now she traveled to visit her sister in a nearby town. She didn't mind the delay. She believed that every journey had its own rhythm. She looked at the photo and remembered the man's voice, his smile, and the day he left on a train that never returned. Thomas Green sat alone at the back. He wore a suit, but his tie was loose. His briefcase was closed, and his watch ticked loudly in the silence. He was a businessman, always moving, always planning. But today he felt tired. He didn't know why he was on this train. He had meetings ahead, but none of them felt important. The delay gave him space to breathe, something he hadn't done in weeks. The carriage was quiet. No one spoke. The train didn't move. But inside, something was happening. Thoughts were shifting. Memories were rising. Questions were forming. The delay was more than a pause in travel. It was a pause in life. Each passenger sat with their own story, unaware of how close those stories were to each other. Outside, the mist began to lift. The hills became clearer. The station remained silent. And the quiet train waited, holding its passengers in a moment that would soon begin to change them. Chapter 2. Inner Voices. The train remained still. The platform outside was quiet, and the mist had not yet lifted. Inside the carriage, the silence continued, but it was not empty. It was full of thoughts, memories, and quiet questions. Each passenger sat with their own story, hidden behind calm faces and still hands. Julien Morel leaned back in his seat. His eyes were open, but he was not looking at anything in front of him. His mind had gone back 10 years, to the day he lost his wife. Her name was Elise. She had been kind, strong, and full of laughter. They had shared a simple life, full of small joys, morning walks, quiet dinners, and evenings by the fire. When she passed, something inside Julian had gone quiet too. He had not spoken much since then, not even to his daughter. He was on this train to see her now, after many years of silence. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew it was time. Clara Winter sat with her hands folded on her lap. She looked calm, but her thoughts were loud. She had written a letter to a former student, a boy who once struggled in her class. He had been quiet, like her, and she had seen something in him, something bright. But she never told him. Years later, she heard he had dropped out of school. She blamed herself, though she never said it aloud. The letter in her bag was simple, just a few words of encouragement. But she had never sent it. She was afraid it was too late, or that it would not matter. Still, the letter stayed with her, folded and waiting. Louis Becker sat near the window, his notebook open on his knees. He had drawn a small sketch of the station, but now his pencil rested still. He was thinking about Paris. He had always dreamed of going there, of studying art and walking through museums. But dreams were easy. What scared him was failure. What if he wasn't good enough? What if the city swallowed him whole? He had told his parents he was visiting a friend, but the truth was he had an interview at an art school. He hadn't told anyone. He wasn't sure he believed in himself enough to say it out loud. Marie Duval held a small photograph in her hands. It was old and faded, showing a young man in a hospital bed. His name was Henri. He had been her patient many years ago. He was only 20 when he died. She had done everything she could, but it hadn't been enough. She still remembered his voice, his smile, and the way he looked at her with trust. She had carried the photo ever since. It reminded her of the limits of care, of the pain of not being able to save someone. She was going to visit her sister, but her thoughts stayed with Henri. She wondered if she had done enough. Thomas Green sat at the back, his eyes on his watch. The seconds ticked by, but he felt no urgency. He had spent years chasing time, meetings, flights, deals. But now, he felt tired. He had left home after another argument with his wife. He didn't even remember what it was about. He had taken the train without a clear plan. He told himself it was for business, but deep down he knew he was running. He didn't know if he wanted to go back. He didn't know if there was anything left to return to. The train was still. The passengers did not speak, but their minds were full. Each of them carried something heavy, regret, fear, hope, or memory. The delay gave them time to listen to their own thoughts. It was not a loud moment, but it was important. In the quiet, they began to hear what they had ignored for too long. Outside, the mist began to shift. The sky was still gray, but a soft light touched the edge of the hills. Inside the carriage, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had started to move. Not the train, but the people. Quietly, within. Chapter 3. Invisible Threads. The train remained motionless, still waiting at the quiet station. The mist outside had begun to lift, revealing soft hills and empty tracks. Inside the carriage, the silence continued, but something subtle had started to shift. The passengers did not speak, but their eyes moved more often. Their thoughts reached beyond their own stories. Without knowing it, they began to notice each other. Clara Winter sat with her hands resting on her lap. She had been lost in her own thoughts, but now her attention moved to the older woman across the aisle. Marie Duval gently adjusted the scarf around Louis Becker's neck. It was a small gesture, but full of care. Clara watched Marie's hands, slow and practiced, like someone who had spent years helping others. She saw kindness in the movement, something that reminded her of her own mother. Clara felt warmth in her chest, a quiet reminder that care could be simple and silent. Julian Morel looked toward the back of the carriage. His eyes stopped on Thomas Green, who sat alone, staring at his watch. There was something familiar in Thomas's posture, the way he leaned forward, the way his shoulders carried weight. Julian thought of his younger brother, who had passed away many years ago. They had not spoken much in the final years, and Julian had always regretted that. Now, looking at Thomas, he felt a strange connection. He didn't know the man, but he saw a reflection of someone he had once loved. Louis Becker had been sketching in his notebook, but now he looked up. His eyes met Clara's for a moment. He recognized her. She had been his teacher in school, the one who had always seemed distant but fair. He remembered being afraid to speak in her class, afraid to fail. But he also remembered how she had once left a note on his essay, saying, "You see the world in a special way." He had kept that note for years. Seeing her now, quiet and thoughtful, made him feel something unexpected, gratitude. Marie Duval sat quietly, her photo still in her bag. She looked at Julian and felt a strange memory rise. She had seen him before, many years ago. He had been the train driver on the day her husband was taken to the hospital. She remembered his calm voice and the way he had helped her step down from the carriage. She had never forgotten that moment. Now, seeing him again, she felt a sense of peace. Life had strange ways of bringing people back together. Thomas Green continued to stare at his watch, but his thoughts were no longer about time. He had noticed Marie's gentle movements, Clara's quiet presence, and Julian's steady gaze. He didn't know these people, but he felt something in the air, something soft and human. He had spent years in meetings and airports, surrounded by noise. But here, in this silent carriage, he felt more connected than he had in a long time. None of the passengers spoke. They didn't exchange names or stories. But invisible threads had begun to form between them. Threads made of memory, recognition, and quiet understanding. The train had not moved, but something inside each of them had shifted. They were no longer just strangers. They were part of a moment, part of a shared silence that held more meaning than words. Outside, the mist continued to fade. The hills stood quiet, and the station remained still. Inside the train, the passengers waited. But now, they waited together. Chapter 4. The Crossing Point. The voice from the station speaker was soft but clear. The train would leave in 20 minutes. The announcement broke the long silence, but no one rushed. The passengers began to move slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. The quiet inside the carriage remained, but something had shifted. The delay was ending, and with it came a quiet sense of decision. Louis Becker stood near the door, holding his notebook. He had stopped drawing. His thoughts were too full. He looked around the carriage and saw Clara Winter watching him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held something gentle. She gave him a small smile. It was not loud or dramatic, but it reached him. It reminded him that someone had once believed in him. That smile gave him courage. He felt less alone. Clara didn't plan the smile. It came naturally. She had seen Louis sketching, had noticed his quiet focus. She remembered the boy he used to be, unsure and afraid. Now she saw a young man trying to find his way. She didn't know if he recognized her, but it didn't matter. In that moment, she wanted him to feel seen. Thomas Green stood up and walked toward the luggage rack. Marie Duval was trying to lift her bag, but it was heavy. Without a word, Thomas reached out and helped her. Their hands touched briefly. Marie looked at him and nodded. Thomas felt something shift inside. He had spent years avoiding small moments like this, too busy to notice them. But now, helping someone felt real. It reminded him that kindness didn't need words or plans. It just needed presence. Marie had always been strong. She had carried others for most of her life. But now, she allowed someone to carry something for her. She didn't know Thomas, but she saw tiredness in his eyes. She saw a man who had forgotten how to rest. She didn't speak, but her silence was full of understanding. Julien Morel sat with a letter in his hand. He had written it for his daughter, planning to give it to her when they met. It was full of words he hadn't said in years, apologies, memories, hopes. But now, holding the paper, he felt uncertain. The letter was safe, but distant. He folded it slowly and placed it back in his coat. He would speak to her instead. He would use his voice, even if it trembled. He had waited too long to stay silent. The train was still not moving, but the people inside were. Not in steps, but in choices. Small actions filled the space, smiles, gestures, decisions. These were not random. They were crossing points, quiet moments where lives touched without noise. No one knew the full story of the person beside them, but they felt something true. Outside, the mist had almost disappeared. The hills were clear, and the sky was pale blue. The station remained quiet, but the train was preparing to leave. Inside, the passengers were ready too. Not just for travel, but for change. They had entered the carriage as strangers. Now, they were part of something shared. The crossing point was not loud. It was soft, like a breath before a word. But it mattered. It was the moment when silence turned into meaning. And for each person on the quiet train, it was the beginning of something new. Chapter 5. The Journey. The train began to move slowly, pulling away from the quiet station. The wheels turned with a soft rhythm, and the carriage gently rocked from side to side. Outside the window, the mist had lifted, revealing green fields, small villages, and narrow bridges. The morning light touched the hills, and the sky opened into a pale blue. The silence inside the train remained, but it had changed. It was no longer heavy. It felt calm, thoughtful, and full of quiet meaning. Louis Becker sat near the window, his notebook open again. He had stopped drawing earlier, unsure of what to put on the page. But now, his pencil moved with more confidence. He sketched the hills, the trees, and the shapes of the passing houses. He didn't worry about being perfect. He just wanted to capture the feeling of the moment. He wrote a few words beside the drawing. The journey begins when you stop hiding. He didn't know where those words came from, but they felt true. Clara Winter watched the landscape as if she had never seen it before. The trees looked taller, the fields wider, and the light softer. She had taken this train many times, but today felt different. She noticed the colors, the movement, and the quiet beauty of the countryside. Her thoughts were still with the letter in her bag, but now they were lighter. She didn't know yet if she would send it, but she felt closer to the decision. The world outside reminded her that time moved forward, and so could she. Thomas Green leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to rest. He didn't think about meetings or phone calls. He didn't count minutes or plan his next step. He simply breathed. The sound of the train was soft and steady, like a heartbeat. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to fade. He didn't know what he would do when he arrived, but he knew he wanted to be present. That was enough for now. Marie Duval held her bag close, her fingers resting on the photo inside. She didn't take it out again. She didn't need to. The memory was with her, quiet and strong. She looked out the window and saw a small church in the distance. It reminded her of the one where she had worked as a nurse many years ago. She thought of the people she had helped, the ones she had lost, and the ones who had changed her. She felt peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she had lived with care. Julian Morel sat quietly, watching the other passengers. He didn't speak, but he felt something deep inside. He saw Louis writing, Clara thinking, Thomas resting, and Marie remembering. He felt connected to them, even without words. He had spent his life driving trains, moving people from one place to another. But now, he saw that the real journey was not about distance. It was about change. It was about what moved inside a person when the world outside slowed down. The train passed over a bridge, crossed a river, and entered a valley. The sun rose higher, and the light filled the carriage. The passengers remained quiet, but their silence was full of life. Each of them had taken a step, not with their feet, but with their hearts. They were not the same as they had been at the station. Something had shifted. Something had begun. The journey was not finished. The train still had miles to go. But inside, the passengers had already started to arrive. Chapter 6. Resolution. The train slowed as it approached the final station. The wheels made a soft sound against the tracks, and the carriage gently rocked one last time. The sky outside was clear now, with pale sunlight touching the rooftops and trees. The mist was gone. The journey had ended, but something deeper had just begun. Inside the train, the passengers prepared to leave. They moved quietly, gathering their bags and coats. No one spoke. There were no goodbyes, no shared words. But the silence was not empty. It was full of quiet understanding. Each person carried something new, something they had found during the delay, during the journey, during the stillness. Louis Becker stepped off the train with his notebook in his hand. He walked slowly, looking at the station and the people around him. He had made a decision. He would apply to the Art University in Paris. He didn't know if he would be accepted, but he was ready to try. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had seen something in himself, something worth following. Clara Winter walked past the platform with her bag over her shoulder. The letter she had written was still inside, but now it was no longer hidden. That evening, she would send it. She didn't expect a reply, but she knew the words mattered. She had carried them too long. Letting them go was part of healing. She felt lighter, as if the train had helped her release something she didn't know she was holding. Thomas Green stood near the exit, holding his briefcase. He looked at his watch, but not with stress. He had called his wife from the train, using the payphone in the corridor. The conversation was short, but honest. He had told her he wanted to come home, not for work, but for them. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to listen. The silence of the train had reminded him of what he had been missing. Marie Duval walked slowly across the station floor. Her bag was heavy, but her steps were steady. That night, she would ride to the hospital where she had once worked. She didn't want to return full-time, but she wanted to help. Maybe she could visit patients, offer comfort, or simply listen. She had spent years thinking her time was over. Now she saw that care had no age. Her heart still had room to give. Julian Morel remained on the platform. He didn't rush. He stood near the edge, watching the train rest in silence. He had folded the letter to his daughter and placed it back in his coat. But he wouldn't give her the paper. He would speak to her face to face. He had waited too long to say the things that mattered. The train had reminded him that time was not endless. He was ready to begin again. The passengers walked away, each in a different direction. Their paths didn't cross again, but they had shared something real. The train had been quiet, but it had spoken to them. Not with words, but with space, with stillness, with time to think. It had given them a moment to pause, to reflect, and to choose. The station returned to its usual rhythm. New passengers arrived. New journeys began. But for those who had traveled on the quiet train, something had changed. They had moved forward, not just in distance, but in life. Moral: sometimes silence speaks louder than words. People are connected not only by actions, but by thoughts, glances, and shared moments. Even a quiet meeting can change your path, if you're ready to listen. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.